Hello, I'm Lisa Harker, Director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Welcome to this lunchtime talk where we'll be joined by Trina Robson, Programme Director for Love Barrow Together, based at the Women's Centre in Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria. Trina is our fourth guest in this In Conversation With series. During these lunchtime talks, we'll have frank discussions with leading thinkers, experts, practitioners, and those with lived experience of the family court. 8 years ago, Trina and a colleague set up Love Barrow Families, a co-produced, co-located service for families involved with statutory mental health and children's social care services. This pioneering service, working in partnership with families, was set up in the context of public sector cuts and huge pressures on services. So we're going to be discussing how it came about, what it has achieved, and the lessons that can be learned. But before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about the format of today's event. There are lots of you attending, and while we won't be able to see you during the event, we do want to hear from you. So please share your questions and your comments in the chat tab. We've already received lots of questions for Trina in advance. Thank you to everyone who sent a question in. We will try and address as many questions as we can, but all of your questions and your comments will be read by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory team, helping to shape future research and events. We are recording today's event and it will be available via our website if you'd like to revisit the talk. But now I'd like to welcome Trina. Thank you for joining us.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with finding out more about what Love Barrow Families really is. I described it as a co-produced service. How would you describe it?
I mean, the first thing to say is that it was a few years ago now that I set up Love Barrow Families. And yes, at the time, I think that we would have described it as a co-produced service. I think that sometimes the use of the term co-production gets kind of bandied around and people don't quite understand what it means. I think for us, we were very clear. We used the New Economic Foundation's definition of co-production. And I guess what we wanted to do was to listen to what families in Barrow needed, those families who were the most excluded, isolated, whatever you want to call them. Yeah.
So at the time you were working, I think, for the NHS, am I right?
Yeah, I was working for Cumbria Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. I was working for before I set up Love Barrow Families, I was working for the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. So I'd been there about 8 years.
And you previously worked as a social worker for many years in the local authority and for the NSPCC. So where did the idea come from?
It came from lots of things. I think it was more than an idea. Sometimes it feels like it was a lifetime's work. I guess coming from Barrow was important. I was born in Barrow and brought up in Barrow. And I was very clear that we had a sense of belonging and goodness and assets in Barrow that made a difference. And one of the things I was thinking about when I'd been looking at the questions that people had sent in was about, I suppose, where I was when I was younger. And when I was about 18, I was a young mum, and I lived in a neighbourhood that was one of the most deprived, it's in the top 3% most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. And I really remember the people. They were very colourful, but I also remember the way that people looked after each other. And I was a foster parent at the time. We fostered teenagers, and the girl that we had living with us, she used to bring all sorts of friends and people in that we would kind of chat to and feed and things. And that was just how it was in those days. So I guess that was important in terms of the idea as well. I think at the time that we set it up, the integration agenda was big everywhere, particularly in health. Everybody was talking about integration. And I'd looked at a few other places that were integrating services. I think Torquay or Torbay had integrated adult services, adult local social care and health services. So it was big on the agenda. At the time when I was in CAMS, there was a reorganisation, things were really difficult. I was also having some personal experiences because of one of the young people that we fostered was in a adult mental health unit, and I was trying to help her, and I was also looking after a daughter, and things felt like they were really quite dire. And I remember the impact of having one person. It was a consultant psychiatrist who used to chair the meetings, but just how important it was that he listened and that he cared, really. And I suppose that made me think, as somebody who's on the end of that as a family member, that's a brilliant thing to give to people, in spite of all the cuts and the problems that there were at the time. And I met a guy called John Howarth, who is one of the executive directors for the Health Trust, the NHS Trust, and he helped us to apply for an innovation bursary. So that's really how we got started.
So you decided you wanted to do something about this. You wanted to create something where families were involved in designing the service, and you managed to get a grant. How did you go about persuading the local authority and the NHS Trust that this was a service that Barrow needed?
The NHS Trust felt like it was fairly straightforward because we had a lot of support from the board, really, at the time, particularly John Howarth. And also because they had these innovation bursaries that we could apply for, we weren't asking for any extra money, if you like. The local authority was a little bit more of a challenge because obviously I wasn't working for them. And I think the thing that made a difference was relationships, the people that we had relationships with at all levels. So there was a senior manager in the local authority in Barrow at the time. I think he might have been an agency worker, but he was really supportive of the idea, and it was really him that helped us to bring to life what the families had said they wanted.
And so you decided to go about trying to co-design a service with families, but presumably you first had to get families' trust. How did you start that process?
I think it started many, many years ago. When I first started fostering, I became a social worker. A lot of people knew me in Barrow. I already had relationships with a lot of people. I'd worked with many, many families. So to some degree, I think we already had some trust. But what we did was we went and asked a number of families that we were involved with, families in all sorts of different circumstances, all families that would be regarded as complex, I guess. We just went and asked them, would you help us to think about what's working, what isn't, and what we could do differently? And they jumped at the chance. And that, to be honest, that's been my experience of families in Barrow, people on the end of services. They're often very keen to help and often want to change things for other people, to make things better for other people.
And what did families say they really wanted when you asked them?
So we facilitated, I think it was 5 meetings in total with families. The last 2 meetings were also with a group of local practitioners that we've met with. But the families were very clear what they said, and they wanted, I mean, they're not a surprise, these things are not really a surprise, but compassion and understanding. They wanted services that supported the adults as well as the children, so joined up children and adult services, and also support when they needed it, so 24-hour support. They wanted services that were developed locally and that would respond as soon as they asked for help and not keep them waiting until things got worse. They wanted to not have to live in fear of their children being taken away. We had quite a lot of conversations about that, about people's experiences and what they needed. And it was very much about not wanting to be passed from one social worker to another, but also wanting honesty and clarity about what they were being asked to change, really, so that they understood. Because a lot of families told us that it went over the top of their heads sometimes, the discussions that were had in case conferences. So yeah, and the final thing was an honest and equal relationship with one main person, so that the services were coordinated by somebody rather than the family themselves having to do that.
So armed with all this information about how to do things differently, how did you set about setting up a service that was really kind of countercultural to a lot of the way that services were being run by the local authority and by the health trust?
So I had a lot of help from the health trust in pulling things together into a plan. I had lots of people in IT, various people helping us and supporting us. And we pulled a plan together, basically. We asked the families for the top 5 priorities. We worked with the practitioners, the services, and they came up with their priorities. And then I was helped to draw up a plan, to design a plan, which we put into Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust to apply for the bursary. And then we got a bursary from health. And then we also, I think at the same time, the Troubled Families initiative was around. So we ended up having, I think it was the second year was funded through the Troubled Families funding.
So you got funding in place, you got some staff in place. How did the existing services respond? Were you a sort of interface between, you know, families came to Love Barrow Families, needed some help, and you helped to broker that help, or how did that relationship work?
We knew right from the beginning that the service was going to be a reorganisation of services, of the services that families get from everywhere, so that it wasn't about designing anything fancy or having lots and lots of funding from anywhere. It was about reorganising things so that families had a better experience. And the relationships that I'd built with people at senior levels kind of supported that, really. And I was thinking in preparation for this conversation today about the significance of the relationships, really, because the people who helped us from health and from social care, the really senior managers, they also found the right people to come to the team, if you like, through the relationships that they had. So we had the convents from adult mental health. We had a consultant psychiatrist. He was only with us, I think it was half a day a week, but who gave support to the team and also to individual family members when they needed it. We had a community support worker from adult mental health. We had CAMs in the team. So it was literally all the services around whole families. And the other thing that we tried to do was to make sure that right from the beginning, families themselves knew that what they brought was important. So we had a time bank at the time, or we called it a time bank, where families gave an hour of their time to help another family, and then they got an hour back.
That's interesting. Did that help to build up trust? So, you know, how did you ensure that families felt comfortable coming to this service?
The building was important. So one of the pillars of what we did was assets, was thinking about assets, what assets we had, and we had a good relationship with a local head teacher who gave us our first office in her school. So we literally just had one office upstairs in the school. And the first 10 families that we worked with came from that school. So it was really about the head teacher having a relationship with the family that then helped to build a relationship with us. I think people felt that because they trusted the head teacher and she trusted us, that it was worth giving it a go.
So having kind of got this service up and running and got both the services to work well with it, but also the families to feel that they could trust it, I wonder what surprised you. I mean, what things did you end up doing that you weren't expecting at the beginning? Did it take you to try and solve problems that you weren't expecting to?
One of the things I haven't said that was important was that we use the dynamic maturational model of attachment. So I've done a lot of training with Dr. Crittenden, and we were very clear that what we needed to do was understand what was happening in families, properly understand. And so we used the adult attachment interview with all of the parents who were involved with the project, and some of the school age and preschool age assessments with children as well. And I think, well, I remember the AAI, the adult attachment interview that I did with one of the mums, who I'd known previously when I'd been a social worker. She'd been in care herself, and she had 3 children. She was really struggling. And to be honest, it was the first family we took. My heart sank. I just thought, how on earth are we going to be able to help this lady? And she came into the adult attachment interview with her head down, a hood up, really, really difficult to engage. But what the adult attachment interview did was it showed us all of the struggles and the hurdles that she'd got over, I guess, in her life. And so when she came back for the second appointment and I talked to her about the adult attachment interview, we weren't talking about problems, we were talking about strengths. You know, the fact that really, given her life experiences, she'd done wonderfully well to have her 3 children even living with her. So I think we knew that that was what we wanted to do. And it was there was a surprise, I guess, in how quickly families felt connected to that. It was the outcome of the adult attachment interview, I think, because it looks at trauma and loss and those things that are often the things that get in the way with parenting. People really felt that someone understood them right from the beginning. So families leapt into that, to be honest. I think, you know, we expected that families would trust, but I think because, I mean, what the person who did the AI with, what she said to me was that when she looked into my eyes, she didn't feel judged. And that's always felt really important to me. And looking back now, it still feels really important because we talk about values and all of our services have values and, you know, equality and compassion and kindness and things, but it's in the very small interactions with people that, you know, it's how you behave, isn't it? As to whether they can perceive that you are not judging them. So, yeah.
So that takes me on to ask you about child protection and how the service managed that interface with what might be necessary to intervene in a family when a child is not safe. Was child protection part of your service, or did it sit outside the service?
It was part of the service. And I mean, that was one of the unique things about Love Barrow Families. And now when I look back, I think how on earth did that happen? But as I said before, we had a senior manager who was very supportive of the family's wish. And I guess we supported them too in saying that they needed consistency and not to be passed from social worker to social worker. So yes, we had a lead social worker who well, she took the lead on all the child protection cases. Some of the families that we had were families where there was quite serious adult mental health issues. Some were where there was child protection or children who were even in care. So the qualified social worker that we had in the team, she led on those with those families.
And I'm interested to learn whether it made a difference. So did you see a change in the number of children or families subject to child protection plans?
Saw a massive change. Yeah, we saw a really big change. So I think we had something like 22 children on the child protection register when we started. And it was either 2 or 3 when we finished. Children returned home from care who stayed at home, who are still at home now, actually. And many of the families, what they felt about it and what they would say now if they were here was that it was a sense of belonging that was created by Love Barrow Families that made the difference to everything, to all of the outcomes that they were able to achieve. And many of them would talk about feeling as though they had extended family. And sometimes I think because there was a bit of a clash in culture with the local authority and the way that child protection worked, there was often criticism of maybe we were too soft, or, you know, maybe we were too kind to people. But actually, we were probably harder on the families than you know, other people may have been, because, well, A, we knew them so well, so we're very confident of what was happening, and families trusted us enough to tell us. And B, when you're in a family, in a family that functions, what you do is you're honest with people and challenge and tell them, don't you? And that was very much the tack that we took. And we had a really good senior team, you know, like, so we had a systemic psychotherapist. I mean, I'd had a lot of years of social work social work experience by then, and there was people wanted the risk to be held. You know, that it was at a time, particularly locally in Barrow and in Cumbria, where practice was very risk aversive. It was difficult for people, and we'd had some professional social workers and CAMS workers who had been vilified, and they'd been in the local paper when things had gone wrong. So it was quite a leap, really, for people to take, to kind of trust that we knew what we were doing and to get, you know, to support us.
And the service was formally evaluated. Am I right in thinking Northumbria University did an evaluation?
Yeah, so Sharon Vincent from Northumbria University did our evaluation, yeah.
You talk about it in the past tense. We were obviously set up the service and involved until 2018. What's happened since then? Where is Love Barrow Families now?
So in 2018, what happened was the funding. In terms of funding, what we had was my post and the lead social worker post and the local authority and the NHS. The funding disappeared in 2018, basically. So we moved from being, well, we had to make a choice about whether we were going to continue or not. And we had a number of families that were involved. And so we decided that we would try and continue in a different way. So we set up as a community interest company, and Love Barrow Families still runs as a community interest company. My colleague Alison Tooby, who set Love Barrow Families up with me, she runs Love Barrow Families. And we were lucky because some of the funders, we had a national funder, the Tudor Trust, who really helped us in that first year. We shared a salary in the first year because we wanted to make sure that we kept going. And then the Siegelman Trust, I think somebody from the Siegelman Trust might be here today. They supported us and still do. So we were lucky. Yeah, but we changed in 2018. The statutory services no longer were part of what we were doing.
So you continue as a community enterprise company, but the child protection statutory part of it has returned to the local authority. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you know, has it changed in terms of families' engagement with the service? Is it still a trusted service?
Well, it's definitely still a trusted service. Work with many more people, reach a lot more people in the community. I think there's lots of community groups running, lots of activities, lots of involvement with the community, doing litter picks and things like that. So it's really, yeah, it is trusted, and I think that that's been a great success, that families told other families that they could trust us. I think that's how the trust built, really. And I suppose what I'm doing now is trying to take some of what we learned from Love Barrow Families and work with other people, along with a colleague from who runs the Women's Centre, Rebecca, to try and effect services more widely in a third around statutory services.
So this is Love Barrow Together. This is what you're currently doing. So how are you going about persuading other services to think along these lines?
We've got quite, well, in terms of third sector, we've got a lot of services who are already working in similar kinds of ways. It's not always, you know, you don't always know that you're using theory. You know, sometimes people just do the right thing. You know, like one of the things we've talked about, we've got 12 principles. One of them is one step at a time. So when I worked at Love Barrow Families, we used the zone of proximal development a lot. And it was around trying to help people take the very next manageable little step they could take. So you push them a little bit, but not so far that they fall over. And that was really important because everybody wanted the families that we worked with to take big leaps or meet new people. And it was very much about breaking it down. So what's in this person's zone? What can they manage to do? So one of our principles, we're calling it the Barrow Way. We've got 12 principles, is one step at a time. And there are services that are already doing that, you know, like hand holding to take people to appointments and things like that. But they don't think of it in terms of the zone of proximal development. They're just doing the right thing.
So interesting. You've kept in touch, I think. Well, you obviously live in Barrow and you're well known to the families. And I think you've kept in touch with some of the families who were originally part of the service. And how are they doing? I mean, you know, 8 years on, what's been the impact, do you think?
I think we always knew when we set it up that we wanted longer term impacts. It was always about trying to make sure that families did better in the longer term. We weren't into short quick fixes. And as far as I'm aware, all of the families have kind of sustained the changes that they were able to make. I know that the children that returned home are still at home. We had a couple of people who had been in and out of prison for years and years. They've stayed out of prison. And the other really lovely thing is that many of the families are in touch with each other. So they've remained friends and support each other. You know, even the ones that don't need to go into Love Barrow Families anymore, it's lovely because they have tea with each other. And, you know, if one of them needs something, they'll ring somebody up. And we've got a couple of the families that are involved in trying to change things for other families. So we've been involved a little bit with Andy Bilson, and the advocacy movement. Two of the parents from Love Barrow Families have been involved with that, and also with some of the podcasts that we've done for research in practice.
So interesting. With the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything differently? What sort of lessons have you drawn from setting up Love Barrow Families?
Well, to be honest, if I'd have known what it was going to be like, I don't know if I'd have done it in the first place. Pat Crittenden said to me once, it's a bit like having a baby. But you kind of can't go back again. What did I learn? I learned that if you create a sense of belonging for people, that what can happen is awesome. We talked about it in terms of magic dust. The magic dust is in the relationships, and that came from my experience in the psychiatric unit right at the beginning, that really is true, that there is magic dust. I also learned that we should ask families, especially the families that really struggle or that we label the most, we should ask them what they want to do, what their aspirations are, what they're interested in, what are they good at. And we learned to do that with Love Barrow Families, but we always wished we'd done it more right at the very beginning, because it blows you away, some of the things that people kind of come up with. And we tried to use some of the small pots of money that we got from funders to support people to do training courses or just take the next little step towards volunteering. And two of the families worked for Love Barrow Families. They were employed at Love Barrow Families. One of them is still there.
That's great. And you mentioned a couple of times Pat Crittenden's DMM model of attachment. I mean, this is a particular approach, and you talked about the profiling that you did of families. What took you to that model? And it sounds like that's been quite key to the way that the service has worked.
Yeah, so when I worked for the NSPCC team that I worked for, we undertook child protection work. So we did independent investigations where professionals were involved in, whether something happened in a professional's life. So I did that. And I also worked a lot with adopted and foster children. So I looked after children primarily. And I was very interested in the fact that the children often got referred and people didn't really look at what was happening in the family. And it just so happened that at the time, Dr. Crittenden was coming over to Manchester to train in the adult attachment interview. So I went to do that training, which was, I think it was 21 days. It's quite a rigorous training. And it really helped me to think about the contribution that foster parents make, adoptive parents, all of us really in our families, and I guess how important it is to understand that as well, if you're going to help people.
Yeah. Amazing. That has been such an interesting reflection on what is clearly an incredible service, and one that still is having a day-to-day impact in Barrow. Lastly, what would be your advice to someone listening to this and thinking, can I do this in my local community? What would be your advice to them?
Well, I think we all. I read something recently that was talking about spirituality and that we all have a spark of genius in us. I think if people have something inside them that's telling them they want to try and change things and do something different, then I wouldn't want to tell them to hold back. I think the thing to do is build relationships with people. And one of the things that Pat Crittenden has really helped me with is, we're go and find people in senior positions and talk to them. Pat, in terms of confidence, she always said, well, just go and ask, just go and talk to people. So yeah, and find allies wherever you can. And I guess the other thing is believe in yourself and believe in families.
That's a great note to end on, a little spark of genius in everyone. But we've certainly seen a spark of genius in you. So thank you so much for sharing that whole story. And thanks to everybody who's joined to listen in today. If you would like to find out more about Nuffield Family Justice Observatory's work, please visit our website, which is nuffieldfjo.org.uk. To be kept informed of upcoming research and events, you can sign up to our regular bulletins at nuffieldfjo.org.uk/subscribe. Finally, we'd be really grateful if you could fill in our event feedback form, because we always take note of people's comments and that helps to shape future events. But most of all, we look forward to welcoming you all to future events. Thank you all very much.